Are preparing the stream. All this technology is just still
Yeah.
all interesting. Are okay, perfect. And then we're gonna let folks in. Okay. I meant to say, Nadia, I like your fit, I like your outfit.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks
Yes.
for joining.
Welcome, everyone. Thank y'all so much for joining. Hello. Hello, Alex S. Thank you for joining. Super excited about this wonderful teaching led by Dr. Nydia A. Swaby about Amy Ashwood Garvey. Thank y'all for joining us on a Saturday.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining on a Saturday.
That means that they're really excited about this teaching. I see. Hi, hey Said. Hey Ari Kamara. Sasadia Minor. Hi, how are y'all doing? Feel free to share your name, your pronouns, and where you're based. Love to shout folks out.
Hi, hi, hi. I see some names I recognize. Hi, friends. Hi, old friends. Hi, new friends.
Thank y'all for joining. We're going to get started in a moment or two, a few moments. We're just waiting for more folks to come in. Hi, Alexandria from Dallas. Hey, Fuluke from London. Hello, hello, hello. Lisa from Birmingham. So nice to have y'all here. I've been waiting for this teaching for a while. So, Nadia, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for the invitation. And thank you to everyone who's joined. It's cool to see where everybody is based. Yeah.
Yeah, we have folks from South
Oh, hi, Pamela.
London.
I see someone who's currently playing Amy Ashwood Garvey in a play that's going up in Manchester soon. So that's kind of cool too.
That is awesome. That is amazing, amazing, amazing. Well, we're going to get started. Because I want to honor your time, Nadia. I'm huge on honoring people's time. But my name is Jamie Swift. I am the founder and executive director of Black Women Radicals. And if you're not familiar with us, we are a Black feminist advocacy organization dedicated to uplifting and centering Black feminist activism around the world. I have the honor and pleasure to introduce Nadia Swaby, who I want to give a little background. I have a list of people that I've always wanted to work with, always wanted to work with. It's a long list. And when I was crafting this series on Black Feminist Marronage, which Nadia's teaching is a part of, I had put Nadia's name as one of the people I wanted to work with. And then I get a DM from your publisher, working behind the scenes, and like, oh, there's this book out about Amy Ashwood Garvey. And then we got connected in Kismet. So it was meant to be. So thank you, Nadia, for everything. But I'm excited to introduce Dr. Nadia Swaby, who is going to be leading a teach-in titled Black Feminist Marronage in London on the enduring legacy of Amy Ashwood Garvey. So I'm super excited to introduce Nadia, who is a Black feminist, artist, researcher, writer, and curator. Her practice engages archives, autoethnography, photography, and the moving image and the imagination to explore the gender, diasporic, and affective dimensions of Black being and becoming. Nadia is a member of the editorial board for Feminist Review and co-edited its archives issue. She holds a PhD from the Center for Gender Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, and has previously worked at the Institute of Contemporary Art, London, and the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Nadia was a Card Research Fellow jointly based at the Royal Museums Greenwich and in the UCL's Center for the Study of the Legacies of British Slavery. She is currently a Whose Heritage Curatorial Fellow at Royal Museums Greenwich and contributes to the advisory board for the Atlantic Worlds Gallery at the National Maritime Museum. Nadia's artist film, Daughters of Diaspora, was recently screened at the Singapore International Photography Festival. Her book, Amy Ashwood Garvey and the Future of Black Feminist Archives, was published by Lawrence Wishart in October 2024 as a part of LW's Radical Black Women series. So without further ado, I pass it off to Nadia. who's going to be leading this wonderful teaching about Amy Ashwood Garvey.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for that introduction. Didn't realize you're going to read my whole biography, and I appreciate it. And I appreciate all of you for joining this teach-in. It's such a gift and an honor to be here today to support this incredible initiative to help the School for Black Feminist Politics get a bricks and mortar in the DC area. But also to share my work on Amy Ashwood Garvey and to think about Amy Ashwood Garvey's work through this idea of Black feminist marronage. I was hoping that I would be able to start off the talk playing a sound clip. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get the sound to work. So I'm going to try it and just see if it comes through. If it doesn't, let me know, and I will shift as a different way of introducing the talk. So let me see if it comes through.
Ladies and gentlemen, who was Marcus Garvey? Who was this man whom Bishop Ransom of the AME Church called the mightiest prophet of the age? Who was this man of whom the Israelite James Weldon Johnson once said, he has the daring energy of a Napoleonic personality that draws master followers. He stirred the imagination of the masses as no other leader ever had. In the course of
Okay, that worked. Great.
Nydia, 1 second. You are in presenter view and we can see everything. Okay, perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So that was the voice of Amy Ashwood Garvey, recorded in 1968 for Up You Mighty Race, Recollections of Marcus Garvey. While the focus is, of course, on the great Pan-African leader and his legacy, it is also a portal into Amy Ashwood Garvey's own narrative authority. Her voice is deliberate, intimate, and unflinching, and even as she recounts Marcus Garvey's legacy, she quietly reclaims space for her own. When she asks, "Who was Marcus Garvey?" we're invited, if not compelled, to ask in turn, "Who was Amy Ashwood Garvey?" That question has guided my work for more than a decade. Much of my scholarly and creative life has been shaped by a central question. What does it mean to care for the traces of Black women's lives, especially those whose histories are scattered, partial, or deliberately forgotten? Amy Ashwood Garvey has been a central figure in that journey, often remembered as Marcus Garvey's first wife. Her legacy has been partly because of that relationship and the dramatic situation that resulted in their divorce, but also because her archive is fragmented across the Caribbean, West Africa, the United States, and the United Kingdom. My recent book, Amy Ashwood Garvey and the Future of Black Feminist Archives, is both a biography and an archival experiment. It traces Amy's life through photographs, letters, sound, and moving image recordings, materials gathered from traditional archives, private holdings, and digital collections. It's a project that I think of as biographical, but a meditation also into the future of Black feminist archival practice. It asks how archives can be activated, imagined, and reassembled as sites of living knowledge. So Amy's life and activism, of course, is at the heart of this book, but it also is my reflection on the process it took coming to know her through scattered materials, through care, and through time. And so today I'm going to be sharing a part of that journey, focusing on how the diasporic social spaces Amy Ashwood Garvey established and nurtured in London might be read through that idea of Black feminist marronage, as articulated by the aims of this series, and to explore how Black women created spaces of sanctuary, survival, and solidarity in London in the face of repression, political erasure, and structural violence. Amy Ashwood Garvey was born on January 10th, 1897, although that date itself is contentious, and I'm happy to talk about that in the questions if anyone is interested. But she was born in Port Antonio, Jamaica, to a middle-class family that was shaped by Afro-Caribbean cultural traditions, Methodist Christian values, and entrepreneurial ambition. Her father, Michael Delbert Ashwood, was a successful Black Jamaican businessman who Amy would later discover was of Asante descent. And her mother, Margarina Ashwood, née Thompson, was the daughter of a mixed-race Haitian woman who had migrated to Jamaica in the mid-1800s. So Amy grew up very aware of a kind of racial hierarchy, of the systems that have configured the Caribbean, of the legacies of colonialism, and the legacies that shaped her family's own migration and settlement in Jamaica. And soon after the birth of her younger brother, her family moved to Cologne, and it was during the height of Panama's canal's construction. And there, Amy began her education at a Spanish-speaking school with a Methodist church opposite. And these spaces played a significant role in her early understanding of herself as a part of a transnational Black subjectivity, because she was there with other Black students and Black people from other parts of the Caribbean. In 1908, Amy returned to Jamaica to attend Westwood High School for Girls, a school that was known for its rigorous curriculum and inclusive ethos. Westwood welcomed students regardless of color, class, or religion, and it was at a time when most of Jamaica's schools denied children based on their color of their skin. And it was there that Amy thrived. Among her peers, she was very popular. She emerged as a leader with emerging feminist sensibility and a strong drive to empower other Black girls through education. A really pivotal moment in Amy's becoming of her kind of political consciousness, or I would say even her Black consciousness, begins when at the age of 12, she had a conversation with another teacher at her school who explained that Amy was a person of African heritage, explained that her ancestors were enslaved Africans, and Amy was quite upset and devastated at the way that the teacher relayed this information, went home and asked her father to tell them more about their African background and their connection to Africa. Her father then took her to meet her great-grandmother, who told her that she was of Asante heritage, that she had been captured off the Gold Coast, which is now known as Ghana, and she'd been captured and brought to Jamaica as an enslaved African. And she told her that she had been kidnapped from a tribe and that her family and their culture meant iron will and strong wall. And Amy later on recalled that she was proud of hearing this story. She was proud of herself, proud of her ancestry. And she went back to school with a feeling of pride that she had a country, a name, and could hark back to a genealogy. And from that moment, she saw it as her mission to awaken a same sense of Black pride in others. And she wrote, "I suddenly knew the meaning of race and felt a power of blood. From this time onwards, I've nursed the passion in my heart of Africa. I dreamt dreams and built castles in the air." Amy often described herself as a militant champion of the rights of her people, and it's the self-determination that captures both the breadth and urgency of her political life. She refused to separate intellectual work from grassroots activism or culture from politics. Amy fused Pan-African feminism with community organizing, insisting that political leadership could be embodied, creative, and grounded in everyday acts of care. She was, of course, known for being the founding member of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which she served as Marcus Garvey's private secretary and later chaired the Harlem branch of the Women's Division. She is known for having edited the Negro World and helping to distribute it in Harlem, for fundraising for the organization, for bringing arts and culture and literature into its public programming. But even after their divorce, Amy's activism didn't stop there. She was an early Black internationalist who lived and organized across the Caribbean, West Africa, the United States, the UK, building transnational political networks and forging intimate relationships and solidarities along the way. Her work took many forms. She launched political parties and feminist publications, produced theatrical works, founded cultural venues, and opened spaces of refuge, both literal and symbolic, for those in need of community. As a cultural producer, entrepreneur, social worker, and writer, she established restaurants, social clubs, housing initiatives, and vocational programs, all designed to cultivate self-reliance and pride within the African diaspora. So one of her most significant contributions was her focus on Black women's education and economic empowerment. For example, in Jamaica, she founded the Garvey Memorial Institute for Domestic Science Training to provide young women with the skills and critical awareness necessary for independence. And she really wanted to try to have this be one that didn't follow a colonial model of having Black women work in households of white upper class households. Rather, she wanted to build a kind of broader outlook that focused on their ability to have skills that would allow them to work in a variety of different sectors. And so this, I think, is a kind of what you can see as an early sense of class consciousness and a recognition of the intersectional vision of liberation grounded in feminism, Pan-Africanism, and community building. And it defined her work throughout her life. And nowhere is this more evident in Amy Ashwood Garvey's role as a connector and mentor to young activists. For example, her support of African students in Britain, especially during the rise of the Nigerian Progress Union and the West African Students Union, which exemplified a commitment to the next generation of Pan-African leadership. So Amy Ashwood Garvey's reputation as a connector, mentor, and mother figure to young activists was particularly evident in her work with the West African students in London in the 1920s and 30s. Nigerian independence leader Ladipo Solanke recalled that Amy's home became both a refuge and a site of political awakening for West African students who were living in London at that time, students who were navigating a life under colonial rule while studying abroad. Amy offered not only a roof and a meal, but guidance, solidarity, and a radical political education grounded in Black self-determination. Working closely with Solanke, she played a foundational role in the early development of the Nigerian Progress Union, which was a predecessor to the West African Students' Union, which would become one of the most influential anti-colonial organizations of its time. And Amy's involvement wasn't incidental. She introduced the union's founders to a vision of education, not simply as personal advancement, but as a tool for collective liberation. And at 62 Camden Road, WASU established a student hostel that doubled as a political and intellectual hub. It was more than just an accommodation. It was a space where students debated the future of their nations, organized for decolonization, and built the networks that would carry many of them into leadership roles in the post-independence Africa. So in recognition of that sustained support and advocacy, Amy was honored with a Yoruba name, Ayowade, that translates to Mother of Honor, a powerful symbol of the respect and affection she earned from those she mentored. She was widely regarded as a trusted elder, someone she could be counted on, not only for material support, but for political wisdom and moral clarity. And her influence extended across generations. Her home became a bridge between the Caribbean, Africa, and the wider Black world, a space where diasporic kinship and Pan-African visions of freedom could take root and flourish. Amy's commitment to creating spaces of refuge and resistance didn't stop with students. As she deepened her political and cultural work in London, she established a series of community venues that extended her vision of diasporic care, connection, and political mobilization. Among the most significant were the International African Restaurant and the Florence Mills Social Parlour. Opened in the basement of her new Oxford Street residence around 1935, the International Afro Restaurant was Amy's first London-based venture. But it was more than a restaurant. It was a gathering space for artists, intellectuals, and activists from across the diaspora. It was said that Una Marson, Paul Robeson, CLR James, George Padmore, and Jomo Kenyatta, and Eric Williams all hung out there and spent time there. And so this was at a time when Black people were routinely excluded from mainstream establishments in London. So Amy's restaurant offered more than food. It offered belonging. It was a space where diasporic culture was affirmed, political bonds were forged, and where shared visions of liberation were nurtured. Building on that success, Amy and her partner, Sam Manning, opened the Florence Mills Social Parlour at 50 Carnaby Street in Soho, named in honor of the celebrated cabaret singer and performer who used her fame to advocate for African Americans. The parlor quickly became one of the most popular of London's venues, catering primarily to Black clientele. It offered African, Caribbean, and American-inspired food. It played jazz music, calypso. There were comedy nights, and there was dancing late into the night. It was said that Sam Manning would play his calypso records late into the night while people were having political conversations. And so then it was also a site of political organizing. It was a place where the International African Friends of Abyssinia was forged, which was a really important organization that lobbied against the invasion of Ethiopia in the invasion of Ethiopia by the Italian government in 1935. And it was an important place where they gathered together to discuss their strategy. They also met at that place and organized a really important protest that happened at Trafalgar Square, which is depicted in this picture here. And so it was like an important political place where the Florence Mills was an important place where that organization came into being, and it also evolved into the International African Service Bureau, which again raised funds to donate to different decolonial projects in different parts of Africa. And all of these organizations were hosted there, and it brought together again figures like Ross McConan, George Padmore, CLR James. So it was described by Ross McConan, the Florence Mills, as the headquarters of Negroes in the English metropolis. And it really transformed cultural nightlife into a mode of resistance. Amy used music, food, and conversation to make space for diasporic connection and to hold space for political struggle. So these venues were not just businesses, they were part of a kind of Black feminist practice of community building that Amy Ashwood Garvey knew was really important and necessary for building solidarity and community networks in London, but also supporting decolonial struggles in Africa and in the Caribbean. So Amy's lifelong commitment to Black liberation found a powerful expression on the global stage in 1945 when she attended the Fifth Pan-African Congress in Manchester, England. At a time when colonialism was starting to crumble but patriarchal politics remained intact, Amy stood out, not just for her sharp political analysis, but for her unwavering insistence that the liberation of Black women must be central to any post-colonial future. She was the only woman to chair a session at the Congress and was one of the very few women delegates overall. In a speech during the panel on the conditions of Black people in the Caribbean, she addressed this kind of unequal and this unique oppression facing Black women under colonial rule within their own communities. So she drew on her decades long of organizing and highlighted the exploitation of Black women's labor, critiqued wage inequality, and called out the political silencing of Black women's voices in labor movements. It was during this moment that Amy introduced what many have gone on to call the Black woman question into the Pan-African politics. She urged the Congress to confront not only the structural violence of empire, but the internal hierarchies that perpetuated gender-based exclusion. For Amy, feminism and Pan-Africanism were interlocking frameworks, intertwined struggles, and her intervention pushed the Congress to consider the unique material conditions of Black women's lives and their critical role in the fight for decolonization. So Amy's impact was long lasting. 6 of the Congress's final resolutions reflected her influence, including calls for gender equality, greater access to employment for women, and the abolition of, for example, the abolition of the marriage bar, which prevented women from applying for certain higher paid jobs that were covered by the union. In speaking out, Amy carved out a space for Black feminist analysis within a male-dominated patriarchal political arena, modeling a kind of intersectional internationalism that would become foundational to later Black women organizations in London and other parts of the Black diaspora. So I like to think of Amy's Manchester speech as not just a call to action, but also a refusal to separate race from gender, politics from care, or the kind of theory that was happening within the spaces of Pan-African organizing and thinking from the materiality of everyday life. And it was this refusal that resonated so powerfully in her legacy and in the work of generations that followed. So Amy's commitment to building spaces of refuge, education, and political engagement culminated in the establishment of Britain's first Black Women's Center, the Afro Women's Center and Residential Club, which she opened in 1954 at her home in 1 Bassett Road in Ladbroke Grove, West London. The center was more than just a kind of residence, which is what is captured in the name. It was also a radical act of Black feminist space making, a kind of urban marronage in the heart of the metropole. At a time when racism and sexism shaped every facet of daily life for Black women in Britain, the Afro Women's Center offered food, accommodation, vocational training, political education, and cultural activities. It was a site of what we might now call radical hospitality, a place where women from across the African diaspora could find not just shelter, but solidarity. In a climate of post-war austerity, migration, and deep institutional neglect, Amy created a space where Black women could gather, organize, and recover together. The center welcomed newly arrived migrants from the Caribbean, West African students, and from the Caribbean, single mothers, domestic workers, and sex workers, many of whom had nowhere else to turn. Some came for a short stay and left with lifelong relationships and political affiliations. Others stayed for years, becoming part of an informal diasporic network of diasporic kinship that stretched far beyond the walls of the center. In correspondence and interviews, Amy made clear that she ran the center with the same principles that shaped her earlier work: collective empowerment, cultural affirmation, and political education. The women who passed through its doors were given more than meals or a bed. They were given a strengthened sense of purpose and the tools to navigate and resist living in a hostile society. So the Afro Women's Center provided food and accommodation for women in need, but it was never just about survival.
I say they come because they're Black.
It was a space of political and cultural education, hosting study groups, debates, and informal gatherings where women could learn about Pan-Africanism, colonial resistance, and the importance of diasporic solidarity. Amy taught practical skills, supported creative expression, and encouraged women to assert themselves as political subjects. She believed that Black women deserved more than charity. They deserved dignity, self-determination, and a place to build futures together. Over time, the center evolved into the Afro People's Center, broadening its mission while continuing to operate from Amy's home. The shift in name reflected a deepening commitment to collective liberation and a recognition that Black communities in Britain needed spaces where both men and women could organize in resistance to the structural forces aligned against them. The center became a node in a wider network of anti-racist organizing, particularly during critical moments such as the 1958 Notting Hill race riots and the murder of Kelso Cochran in 1959. In the wake of those events, One Bassett Road became home for the Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the Notting Hill Defense Committee, organizations formed in response to fascist street violence, police neglect, and the failures of the British state to protect Black communities. So working in alliances with figures like Claudia Jones, Amy Ashwood Garvey transformed her home into a center of political resistance, legal advocacy, and emotional refuge. It offered advice and legal services for those arrested or fined for defending themselves during the riots and created infrastructure for protests, press, and political strategy.
I say they come because they're Black Britons. They come because they've been under the domination of Britain for over 4 centuries. And they look to England as their mother country.
So that was just a clip of Amy Ashwood Garvey when she was interviewed by Pathé News outside of the Afro Women Center when she was talking about why migrants were coming to the UK. So you can see here that she was very much a part of the kind of early discourse around immigration to the UK, around racial politics in the UK, and around organizing and activism for those who were migrating to the UK at that particular moment. So she's a really important part of this sort of history of Pan-African organizing and community organizing, thinking about what was happening at home, but also thinking about what's happening for African Caribbean communities, what's happening back home, but very crucially about the kind of formations that were happening in London as well, as more and more people were migrating and settling in London in particular. So the Afro Women's Center offered something I think that's quite intimate and profound, a diasporic refuge through everyday life. Women and men alike um, found Amy's home to be a place to eat, talk, study, and to dream. It was a space of laughter and memory, of political planning and spiritual healing. In my book, I described this as Amy's practice of Black diaspora feminist space making, a refusal to accept the terms of racial exclusion, and instead to build fugitive and sustaining worlds in the cracks of empire. When I first visited One Bassett Road in 2010, I stood on the outside of the steps where Amy once posed with 2 of the center's residents. A blue plaque now commemorates her life there, but the deeper memorial lies in the work she made possible. Her legacy lives on, not just in the history, but in the generations of Black women who have continued to work in her path, creating their own autonomous spaces of care, resistance, and becoming. In many ways, we could think of the Afro Women's Center as prefiguring the Black women's centers and housing cooperatives that were formed in London in the 1980s and 70s. Its legacy was carried forward by organizations like Brixton Black Women's Group and the Organization of Women of Africa and African Descent, both of which echoed Amy's insistence that Black women's liberation must be central to any vision of freedom. Through the center, Amy Ashwood Garvey carved out not only physical space, but ideological space for Black feminist thought and practice to flourish. So the Brixton Black Women's Group, which was founded in 1973, was one of the first autonomous Black women's organizations in the UK. And like Amy's earlier initiatives, BBWG created a space specifically for Black women to meet, organize, and imagine new futures. The group identified as socialist feminist and was committed to addressing the political and social cultural needs of women of African and Asian descent. They created a physical and intellectual space to name the specific conditions of Black women's lives, spaces where conversations about immigration, housing, education, and reproductive rights could happen on Black women's terms. And their publications Speak Out kept these debates alive and helped articulate a vision of feminism rooted in anti-racism and solidarity. So in my book, I trace how Amy's model of political hospitality, of using home and the center of sites of resistance and struggle, and also her interest in writing and in Black women's publications as another way of creating kind of transnational network of politically engaged and conscious women working for the liberation of Black women in Africa and the diaspora, laid the groundwork for the formation of groups like Brixton Black Women's Group. I sort of argue there that BBWG extended this legacy by combining everyday survival strategies with revolutionary world building. They were not only building community, they were building theory, publishing, archiving, and advocating for structural change in the same way that Amy Ashwood Garvey was. So founded in 1978, OWAD emerged as a national umbrella organization that brought together Black and Asian women's groups from across the UK. It was an experiment in radical coalition, uniting working class women of color in a shared struggle against racism, sexism, and class exploitation. So OWAD hosted the landmark National Black Women's Conference between 1979 and 1982, drawing hundreds of participants to strategize around education, healthcare, policing, and immigration affecting Black and Asian communities in Britain. There were also a movement in action. They organized protests in Brixton, at Heathrow Airport, and against violent immigration policies and police brutality. So OWAD built on Amy Ashwood Garvey's legacy of Pan-African feminist organizing and diasporic solidarity in a number of ways. I mean, I think in addition to thinking around expanding and working across racial lines, but also thinking quite crucially about introducing new tactics, building new alliances, formalizing what Amy often practiced intuitively. And so through political education, direct action, and collective care, OWAD created spaces where Black and Asian women could claim leadership, define their own agendas, and imagine a future grounded in freedom and justice. The same types of conversations that were happening at Amy Ashwood Garvey's Afro Women's Center, the same types of conversations were happening in the transnational magazines that Amy tried to publish. And I also sort of talk about the way in which the legacy of Amy Ashwood Garvey lives on in the kind of work of community-led spaces that followed the work of OWAD and Brixton Black Women's Group, among them Lambeth's Women's Project, which was based in South London. That was established in 1980s, and it was active for over 2 decades. And it was collectively run. It was a multi-use building that offered resources, support, and organizing space for women and girls. And its room held archives, workshops, counseling sessions, art practices, and activist meetings. And what made LWP especially significant was its embeddedness in radical Black feminist and anti-racist politics of the 1980s and 90s. Politics shaped, as I said, by Amy Ashwood Garvey, by Claudia Jones, by Olive Morris, and collectives like Brixton Black Women's Group and OWAD. So it was run entirely by volunteers for years, very much in the same way that Amy Ashwood Garvey was a volunteer for the organizations she ran. Indeed, the director of Lambeth Women's Project, Ego Ayiwe Sawinski, was unpaid for many, many years. It also served as a meeting place for several women's groups that sort of particular women's groups such as Remembering Olive Morris Collective, Muslim Sisters Jamaat, Eritrean Women's Action for Development, and Black Deaf Sisters. In an interview I did with Ego in 2014, she described LWP not just as a space, but as an archive. She talked a lot about how the rooms bore the marks of collective memory, handwritten posters, campaign materials, zines, photographs, and flyers documenting decades of resistance and care. She explained it as functioning as a living archive, a black and brown feminist organizing, to quote her, that was shaped by hands, voices, and visions of the women who passed through it. And she talked a lot about LWP being a vital space for intergenerational learning, organizing, and mutual support, and how its forced closure, despite urgent protests and community defense, was not just a loss of a building, it was a loss of a political home. And in an article that Ego and Eula Burren wrote that's called Sister to Sister, Developing a Black British Feminist Archival Consciousness, they talk about how the fight to keep WLP open was also a fight to preserve Black women's herstories. And their writing really helped me to realize that and to think a lot more about how spaces like LWP and before that the Afro Women's Center are themselves archival spaces, and that they hold the residue of dreams, debates, refusals, and solidarities that too often go undocumented. So hearing Ego speak about what it meant to lose LWP helped me to reframe what it must have meant for Amy to be forced to close her own center in the 1960s. After decades of offering food, shelter, education, and political refuge to others, she too saw the space she had built through sacrifice and vision withdrawn because of lack of funding. Oh, yeah. So that parallel really stayed with me as I began to write. and it shaped write the book on Amy Ashwood Garvey, and it shaped how I came to understand that Amy, not only as a political organizer, but also as an archivist of the diaspora, as someone who preserved community, not only in papers or speeches, but in rooms, rituals, and relationships. And there's also a way in which Amy Ashwood Garvey was also an archivist of her own collection and of her own life. She was very clearly, keenly aware of the significance of the political spaces in which she organized. She was keenly aware of the significance of the work that she was doing. So she kept material from, for example, from the Afro Women's Center. She kept original documents that typed out the organization's mission. She kept letterhead from that. She kept a lot of letters and photographs that she had collected from friends, photographs from her research and her time in West Africa, books and essays that she had written, newspaper clippings from important political events that were happening during the time in which she was organizing. She was very much reading and thinking about her life within a kind of broader transnational Black diasporic frame, but she was also recognizing that her story was potentially something that was worth archiving and creating and preserving for the future. And that's one of the things I look at through the book about what it also means to see yourself as potentially responsible for the documentation of the political moment in which you are organizing and you're living in right now. And so as I close, I want to return to Amy Ashwood Garvey, not just as a historical figure, but also as a visionary of kind of Black diaspora space making. Throughout her life, Amy created what we might think of as a form of urban marronage, transformative spaces of sanctuary, survival, and solidarity that emerged in the cracks of empire, as I said before. Her parlors, hostels, restaurants, and centers were responses to exclusion, but they were also invitations to imagine and build otherwise. So I think of these kind of buildings potentially then as blueprints for the types of spaces that Jamie is seeking to create through the School for Black Feminist Politics. Each of these spaces offering material refuge and spiritual grounding, each enacting a politics of care and refusal, and to remind us that Black feminist world building often begins in the everyday, in shared meals, in shelter, in study, and struggle. So these are all things that I'm thinking with together in my book, Amy Ashwood Garvey and the Future of Black Feminist Archives. And I want to see it as one of the ways of holding on to that legacy. And I want to reflect on how to remember, how we piece together these scattered histories, and how the archives we build now through writing, curating, protesting, and gathering can shape the futures we deserve. If you're interested in learning more about this work on Amy Ashwood Garvey, you're invited to purchase it through this QR code. But I'm also happy to share and reflect some more on my thinking on her work and thinking about the kind of spaces that she created for political solidarity, for community, for organizing, for future dreaming and planning. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nadia. That was very beautiful, thorough, um, everything I thought it would be. And just please, 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 y'all, purchase this amazing work by Nadia, which truly, as she discussed throughout her wonderful presentation, contextualizes Amy Ashwood Garvey not as the first wife of Marcus Garvey, but for her being a leader, an organizer, a forerunner to radical and revolutionary Black feminists, Pan-African feminists organizing and movement building. And so thank you, thank you, thank you. As I mentioned in the group, in the chat, we're having a Q&A with Nadia. So please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen to ask your questions and to get all this knowledge, this knowledge. And I wanted to say thank you, Nadia, for emphasizing the fundraiser for the School for Black Feminist Politics. And I'm going to share some more because I know you've been speaking for 45 minutes to an hour, and to give you a break. But if you're not familiar with, like I said, Black Men Radicals, Black Men Radicals has a school, the School for Black Feminist Politics, which Nadia's teaching is a part of. And I started the school in 2020 as a rebellion to formal academic structures who seek to exploit knowledge, grassroots knowledge, particularly from working class and poor folks, but excludes them, right? And so I'm like, what would it look like to start a school where there are free teach-ins and folks can learn from people of all sorts of educational backgrounds, all sorts of political backgrounds, and to have this access to this knowledge. And so that's what the school is about. Our mission is to expand the frame of reference of Black feminisms in the field of politics, right? From multidisciplinary, intersectional, and transnational frameworks. And so we're trying to open a school, a physical location for the school, preferably in the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area, given all the backlash regarding the Trump administration's and pushback around DEI and amongst other things. So if you believe in the mission, vision, values of the school, please support because um, we're trying to create a maroon of our own. And so thank you, Nydia, for the plug because I'm very bad at plugging the fundraiser, but thank you for this amazing teaching. So feel free to ask your questions. I think we have a question here. Um, Thank you, Alex, for your question. Thank you for this beautiful teaching. Um, Her dedication to space making really stands out. What is your personal thoughts on how Black women can do that today without letting these spaces be diluted or compromised?
That is such an interesting question, and I don't think I have a settled answer, but rather a reflection on that being an experience that I have had in the variety of different Black feminist organizing, cultural production that I've worked on collaboratively with other Black women, that often becomes a tension around which we are working together, whether it be how do we continue to fund the kind of creative projects that we're doing without being embedded within institutional politics. I've had that experience when I've been in a kind of Black feminist art collective, and the kind of projects that we want to do are only sustainable by being attached to a certain residency. And what happens when elements of the project are co-opted to allow the institutional to represent itself as radical, as supportive of Black feminist ideas, while at the same time we're personally experiencing kind of microaggressions on a regular basis while trying to make that program happen. I've also had the kind of experience of being in a Black feminist collective where tensions on what kind of bigger feminist movements we attach ourselves in order to get access to funding affects the way in which we even imagine the way we relate to each other and how those things trickle in. I don't have a settled answer other than to say that I think it's because the way in which I'm kind of organizing in the present isn't necessarily on the front line in that particular way, but I do have a sense of the perspective that recognizing that this is a kind of tension that happens quite often, and that sometimes it is a tension between collaborate using those resources and having to do what you can within those institutional spaces, but also refusing that and trying to agree to be working more on a kind of volunteer and collaborative spaces in collaborative ways, or generating resources that are specifically funded within Black community. I personally think it would be amazing to hear from Jamie around that, because I recognize that the work that Jamie is doing with the School for Black Feminist Politics as a kind of independent Black feminist school that is obviously fundraised through community and that is supported through she's trying to fundraise and build it through the way in which we support and fund the things that we like to see. I'd be interested in hearing sort of Jamie's reflections on that issue as well, because I think it's something that is definitely present in that the kind of lack of resources can meet. It might take a longer time to build something like that, but it might be really important at the same time to try to generate that as not necessarily attached to an academic institution or another cultural institution, but to have your own bricks and mortar where you can determine the programming, you can determine what initiatives that you're funded. And that feels especially important in the US context, where as we see funding has and will can be so precarious and contingent on broader political intentions that are fundamentally about erasing our initiatives in our spaces. So, I mean, I think it's definitely something I would, I think it's worth opening up and thinking about. And Jamie, if you have any comments on it, but that's my kind of initial reflection, that I recognize that to be an ongoing problem that we're facing with in trying to organize and create our independent ventures. And Amy Ashwood Garvey faced that as well. I mean, the primary reason why the Afro Women's Center wound up having to close is because when one of the people who was giving a lot of funding to the organization found out that she was good friends with Claudia Jones and viewed Claudia Jones as a communist and as someone who'd been deported from the United States, withdrew funding because Amy refused to sever that relationship or sever her partnership with Claudia Jones. So that's something that even Amy Ashwood Garvey grappled with herself.
Wow, thank you so much, Nadia, for that response. I didn't even know this last part. That's yes, that's wow. And it speaks to the precarity. And usually typically I don't like to speak because it's all about you, Dr. Swaby.
Yeah.
But because of, yes, thank you for, offering allowing the space during your teaching for me to respond. But briefly, um, it's this type of precarity that even myself I have to deal with as someone who is in the academic space and who does grassroots organizing to always maintain this separation because we've seen this throughout the years when Black women, Black queer and trans folks try to create our own autonomous spaces. We either have to get funding that has clauses or stipulations, or we try to attach it to an academic institution, and then the academic institution either pacifies it, co-ops it, um, and then we're kind of left back at square one. And so for me, it's so important to keep these separate and autonomous
Mhm.
and to recognize that even this is why we have wanting a fundraiser to own a brick and mortar, to have a space, because even the conditions around leasing and renting, if someone doesn't like your mission, vision, values of a radical Black feminist organization, they can take the space away from you.
Mhm.
And so we've seen this, like I said, this precarity with folks like, I'm definitely inspired by Amy Ashwood Garvey, but also Nanny Helen Burroughs and her creating her school for Black girls, um, Fannie Lou Hamer's Freedom Farm Cooperative, amongst other spaces. It's been done, but how
Yeah,
do we keep it sustainable? And so that's where um, the question lies, I
that's
suppose.
the question. Yeah.
So thank you for that. So we have another question. Oh, we have a couple more questions. Okay, okay. So, Gabrielle, thank you. I just want to say thank you for constantly supporting Black and Radicals and for attending the teachings. I love seeing your name pop up. So, Gabrielle's question is, this may have been something that you may have elaborated on during the beginning, but I would love to hear more about how the archive can be used as a form of transnational Black feminist praxis and the decolonial potential of archives using Amy Ashwood Garvey as a case study. Thank you so much for bringing light to her amazing work.
Thank you for that question. I'm just trying to write down a couple of notes that came to me as you were speaking that I don't want to forget. Okay. That was the question. Oh, wait, it's still.
Do you still see it?
Yeah, okay, yeah, I can come back to it. Great. Um, yeah, I think I would first start by saying that my thinking on the archive as a kind of Black feminist practice is very much rooted in the first instance in the kind of organizing and activist work of groups like the Lambeth Women's Project, the Remembering Olive Morris Collective, the work of community activists and public historians like Eula Burin, Ego Sawinski, and Kelly Foster. And that feels really important that while I had previously worked in the Schomburg Center for Research Black Culture, and I had worked behind the archival table and worked in archives, my real thinking about the kind of Black feminist potential and power of archives was really forged through the kind of ways in which Black women activists were taking, animating, and engaging with the archive as a space for political organizing, as a space for knowledge production, and as a space for radical dreaming. So, for example, I think about, when Ego Sawinski talked a bit about the closure of Lambeth Women's Project and how the experience of that space closing and what was happening with the council withdrawing their funding forced her to think about archiving and documenting that space and how she would collect all of the material that was there, where she would deposit it, and how to keep track of also the letters and the documentation that were coming in from the state so that future researchers would be able to actually know what happened here. And it was her thinking and talking around that, both in an interview I did with her and in an essay with Eula Burin, that struck me as really important in my own reflection on what happened with Amy Ashwood Garvey's archive and the recovery of that. So towards the end of her life, Amy Ashwood Garvey had to leave London, and she was in Jamaica, and she was there as well. As her health deteriorated, it became impossible for her to return to London, and so she was living there, writing letters to Claudio Jones about the worry and concern about her building having to close, losing her building. She does eventually lose the lease on the space, and then she unfortunately passes away in Jamaica. And after her passing, her good friend Lionel Yard heard from another friend, or Lionel Yard, who lived in Brooklyn, heard from another friend who was based in London that some of Amy's papers, letters, all of her archives, her collections, her photographs, all the things, a lot of things that she had been keeping from her life were still in the building, and that he should come and salvage it before they were destroyed. He flew over to London, collected that material, kept it at his house, and it is that which he was able to use to construct a biography about Amy Ashwood Garvey's life. It was that research that informed Toni Martin's biography about Amy Ashwood Garvey's life. Those are the two biographies that were written about her before I wrote my book, and then made it possible for me as well to write my work and to be able to access Lionel Yard's family to look at that archive. I mention that because in thinking about the way in which Lambeth Women's Project talked about and Ego talked about the preservation of that material, it made me really think about what had happened if Lionel Yard had not been in a position to go collect that material in Amy Ashwood Garvey. That story about the Black woman, the Afro Women's Center, the kinds of political activities that happened there, even any of the photographs that we have of her outside of the building or inside would have been lost forever. And so it's for me, it really was instructive for me in thinking about how there's a way in which the kind of organizing and everyday way in which Black women are doing a kind of feminist praxis of organizing is really fundamental to both the kind of archival practice as well, and the kind of documentation of the fact and the reality of our lives. And I think as well that Amy being someone who collected material herself, and collected material that was not only about where she lived immediately, but also was stories about decolonial and anti-colonial activities that were happening in other parts of the Caribbean, stories about West Africa. Indeed, she spent a great time learning about West Africa, documenting the histories and cultures of people there when she traveled. It, for me, also is an entry point in thinking about how she saw the kind of work of documenting our own history and cultures as also a kind of important part, that thing that she could contribute to as well. And so I read both her process of collecting and her life as a kind of archival practice that is about the preservation of the present for a future that hasn't yet happened but must. And she understood that her stories would become an important part of a genealogy of and a map and perhaps a blueprint for forms of organizing that we see in the kind of activities that continued on in the 70s and 80s.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Swaby. We have another question. Could you share more about how Amy Ashwood Garvey might have navigated the divisive challenges among Black ethnicity, for example, tensions between Africans and Caribbeans, and so on?
That's a really interesting question. Um, I mean, I think in the first instance, I don't ever recall Amy Ashwood Garvey writing anything or indicating in any of her tech or in any of her reflections on her political organizing of that moment that some of the tensions and the kind of diaspora wars that you might be referring to were reflected in the kind of political organizing and community spaces in which she operated. But I'd like to imagine that, but I can imagine that just because she didn't name it, doesn't mean those kind of tensions around language, around the relationship to Britishness, around culture and identity didn't necessarily exist. And I think that that's why Amy Ashwood Garvey potentially quite crucially used and tried to create a diaspora space that those different African and African diasporic experiences could be seen as fundamentally shaping of and overlapping of each other. Why she would have created a menu that highlighted the kind of diasporic connections in Black Black cuisine. Why she would have used music as a kind of cultural music and dance and the love of certain types of musical forms as a shared space around which to also engage in political discussion and debate. And so I think my reflection would more so be less to say, be able to provide a kind of specific example on how she navigated those tensions, but rather to say that she was engaging in a kind of practice of Black consciousness raising that I think that I would imagine was attentive and aware of these potential sites for misalignment, but saw herself as a part of a Pan-African movement and a kind of Pan-African ideology that saw Africa and the diaspora as meaningfully connected. And so she moved towards that belief or a belief in that truth. But I would also acknowledge that there are also, some ways in which we might be critical of, for example, her views on Liberia and the kind of project of African American and African Caribbeans settling in Liberia and becoming a part of a project of the displacement of Indigenous African people. So I recognize that there are ways in which her own politics, in my work, I try to critique the own limitations of her own particular understanding of the layers and of coloniality, but also try to think of her as someone that tried to forge connections in those spaces as well.
Thank you so much for that thorough response and that wonderful question. I just wanted to read a comment. Someone wrote, "Thank you for this information. As a child, I knew Amy Garvey, but had no idea of her activities or significance." And so I just think that's a testament to your work, Nadia, and
Mhm.
you know, bringing to the fore more once again this profound like life, leadership, and legacy of Amy Ashwood Garvey. Um, so we have another question. How supportive was Marcus Garvey of her Black feminist pursuits? I have a feeling he wasn't, slash, one reason behind the divorce.
Yeah, that would definitely be one of the reasons behind the divorce, but I think it's much more nuanced and complicated. I mean, I think one thing I would say is that Amy Ashwood Garvey herself writes that Marcus was much more interested in having a helpmate and someone who was a partner of his vision, who was happy to be in the foreground, but as someone who positioned themselves as not a co-leader of the organization, but as someone who helped to facilitate and make possible his leadership. And this is Amy Ashwood Garvey's telling of that Marcus, didn't like the fact that people wanted her to also do a speech when they were going on tour as they wanted him. People didn't like the fact that sometimes her counsel and her perspective on internal politics or also her view on international politics. They welcome that a bit more. She sort of reflects and says that Marcus didn't appreciate that. But at the same time, he did also nurture what he was a shared vision that they had, which is a vision she expressed, but a vision that he recognized as being really important, that Black women had to equally be involved within the organizing of the UNIA and that they served an important role in the kind of, very quintessentially or very classically traditional heteronormative framework of the ideal Black family. I mean, these were very much very important of the politics of the UNIA. And so he saw the work that Amy Ashwood Garvey wanted to do as aligned with that vision, but didn't recognize the other elements around Black women's independence. But I wouldn't say that it's difficult to then say that he was completely dismissive of that, because for me, that would be to dismiss the work of Amy Jacques Garvey, who very importantly built on and continued the work of Amy Ashwood Garvey when she subsequently married Marcus Garvey and contributed to the women's pages in the Negro World, continued to support and advocate for the women's chapter of the UNIA, for the Black Cross nurses. So it's I think in this particular case, it was also a tension around the way in which Amy Ashwood Garvey expressed what her kind of vision of what a Black feminist politics would be. That was, I think, the issue for Marcus Garvey, is that he was happy for it to be expressed, but within a very particular frame and in a particular, such more traditional way.
Thank you for that um, nuanced question, the question and the nuanced response, because yes, there's a lot to say about that.
Yeah, trying to be nuanced, it's complicated one, isn't it?
Yes. Um, there's a comment. Oh, thank you so much, Miss Marilyn Nance. Thank you for being here. Such an honor. And her
Marilyn.
comment. Yes. Oh, you know, Miss Nance too. Yeah.
I do know Miss Marilyn Nance. Yes, very much a supporter and encourager of my work. Appreciate Marilyn. Thanks to Marilyn, I actually will have an event, a book event at Cara in NYC on May 29th. So yes, much appreciation for Marilyn.
Yes, I got to meet her in Chicago like a month or so ago. So, and she wrote, "Thank you, Dr. Swaby. I see Garvey's work in so much of the work of Black women." So, that's awesome. Thank you. The next question we have is thank you so much for this teaching. I'm currently organizing a collective that centers accessible Black history, feminist, literary education outside of higher institutions. And part of me feels inadequate to facilitate these discussions and leading workshops because I don't have a formal degree in any of these fields, although I am a diligent, quote, informal student. Do you have any advice on how to approach this and any role models I could look up to within Black feminist tradition?
Oh, thank you so much for that question and for that kind of vulnerability and willingness to um, share, the feeling that comes with putting yourself in the front of some of your kind of activist visions and your hopes and dreams that can come with feeling inadequate to do that work. Let me first start by saying that there is nothing about having a degree in higher education or any of that that makes anyone more qualified to talk about the lived and embodied and real experience of being a Black woman, of being a Black trans person, of living in a Black body, and the kind of political and feminist impulse that comes from that, I would say, as the first instance. And while I might have a doctorate, I want to reiterate that the people who have been most central to my kind of becoming as a scholar and the research and the questions I ask of the archive of the work that I do have been Black women who might not have fallen within the traditional realm of academic scholarship. So, for example, I think of someone like Kelly Foster. I mentioned her name previously. I think of Kelly, who is a very important public historian who is known for her work on Black histories and Black lives in London and leads a series of, and also is a Blue Badge Guide, which means she's certified by the City of London to give walking tours to give historical walking tours. And she's developed a series of Black walking tours, one of my favorites being a Black feminist walking tour about Black women's movements and Black power in Brixton. And she is a public historian, and she is someone who I think of as very much important to the kind of Black feminist tradition and intellectual life that is generated in the legacy of Amy Ashwood Garvey, but also within the kind of feminist thinking in both writing and practice that has happened in the UK, but in London, I think she's as critical to that as someone who is much more cited in a publication. So to me, for me, I tend to always already find the mentors in different activist spaces. I could just sort of drop off a list of the names of other people, but I think the thing that I would certainly say is to see equally as much value in the kind of activism and the kind of the material organizing as fruitful to understanding a kind of theoretical or embodied perspective on Black feminist practice as reading any Black feminist text. I just think, yeah, that's what I would say to that. Oh, sorry, the woman who did the Blue Badge Guide in London is Kelly Foster. I'll type her name in the chat.
Thank you. That I agree. That's why I had to put in speak in all in all caps in the group chat because that's so true. You don't need a degree or any of these things to do the work. So thank you for that. And then there was also a comment in the chat, where and when will Dr. Swaby be in NYC this month?
May 29th at Cara. I can pull up the website. I haven't even started advertising it because I was so focused on getting ready for this event that I've not even done anything with it. But I do have the link, so I guess this can be the first time I've sort of shared it. Um, this is the link to it. So I'll be there doing a kind of performative reading, focusing on different themes from the book, and I'll be in conversation with Zakiya Collier, who is an incredible Black archivist and memory worker, whose thinking around archives have shaped my own as well.
It's so awesome. And then you'll be in conversation with Zakiya.
Yeah,
Zakiya's
I'm excited. for it.
yes, yes, y'all make sure to attend and support. So we have another question here. Thank you so much for this wonderful teaching. Can you say more about how Amy used music and culture as a part of her organizing? Thank you.
Lisa, thank you so much for that question, and it's nice to see you on here. Maybe I will most specifically talk about her theatrical productions, and I'll also talk about the Florence Mills Social Parlour and just generally some of the stuff that she did in London. But so after Amy Ashwood Garvey left the UNIA, and as I said, she was really instrumental in the use of music and arts in the kind of organizing that the UNIA did. She was known for loving to read the poetry of Paul Laurence Dunbar. She was known for loving to play music, calypso music, jazz at the beginning of events, and also for commissioning some of the orchestras that went on to be synonymous with the kind of sound of the UNIA to be there at UNIA meetings. But after that, during that time that she was living in Harlem, she was very much sort of inspired by the kind of conviviality and culture and buzz of the Harlem Renaissance. She would be living there at the time that the Lafayette Theater would have been an important place to go see plays like Showboat, to see Florence Mills or Paul Robeson on stage. And so she and also that those kind of going to those theatrical productions were also a kind of significant Black event where you could also meet and connect with people from all walks of Black life living in Harlem at the time. And so she then went on to, after her separation from Marcus, to dabble her own hand in writing theatrical productions, and she produced a series of plays that toured throughout the United States. One of them that told the story of Marcus Garvey, another one that told the story about colorism within a family. So she also like kind of used the musical and the plays as a way of telling stories that were affecting Black communities and in some way getting revenge on Marcus Garvey. And she also supported her partner, Sam Manning, who was her on and off again partner, both her lover and her business partner, in the development of his musical group Harlem Nightbirds, and in particular when it toured the Caribbean. She worked as the booking agent for that. And again, they would use the kind of music events as also opportunities to engage in political consciousness. And then, in London, of course, having the Florence Mills Social Parlour and nightclub, which I think it's really important that she named that space that was happening in Carnaby Street in an area that was known for its kind of vibrant nightlife at the time. Um, she named it after a celebrated African American cabaret singer who had performed previously in London, who was also known for advocating for the rights of African Americans. So she also used the name of an important, well-known figure to name her restaurant, and it literally became a place where famous musicians, African American musicians, would pass through, where people would hang out if they were in a theatrical production in London at the time, and people would pop in and sing and would perform and would dance. Sam Manning performed there. There was a jazz club that was in residency for a period of time. And so part of my thinking then is that Amy had a long understanding that one of the particular ways in which to build and create community was around food, was around culture, was around music, and was around nightlife. But she recognized that in those spaces as well, people could gather to learn information about what was happening in different parts of the world and to kind of develop a really critical political consciousness as well. So I, that's something that you can really see, I feel, taking shape very early on in her organizing and activism from the early days in the UNIA, and it's something that she continues on throughout her political life.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yeah, well, we're going to take a couple more questions. Um, I'm seeing. And then also, just as a reference or to share, excuse me, this teaching will be it's going to be on YouTube for you to reference. So and you can always go back and get this lovely teaching and to learn more and more and more about Amy Ashwood Garvey. And please purchase Dr. Swaby's amazing work. Okay, y'all. So the next question we have is, I'm currently researching spiritual activism, the holistic idea that changing our hearts, our souls, and who we are as people towards a vision of love, care, etc. shapes the world. Queer women of African descent and black radical feminist paradigm always come up in my work, so I wasn't surprised to see the word spiritual pop up here too. Do you have any precision on what Amy Ashwood Garvey referred to as spiritual training in the spaces she created, if I remember accurately? And was it religious? To both of you, do you have any thoughts to share on the fact that Black women systematically embrace this form of activism more?
Thank you so much for that really interesting question. I yeah, I'm quite excited by it because I think it allows me to say two things, which is firstly, Amy Ashwood Garvey herself uses the phrase spiritually in her writing about the aims and intentions of the Afro Women's Center and Residential Club, where she says, spiritually, it hopes to create an atmosphere wherein the colored woman may learn to express her latent talents and aspirations for the enrichment of family and national life in full association with others. And so that's something that she expresses on her own in this particular, um, it's a kind of like manifesto or an expression of sort about the aims of the organization. I would say that very early on in Amy Ashwood Garvey's life, and maybe throughout her life, because she was very much forged within Christian values, having been raised in a Methodist family in the Caribbean. Her father had been raised Seventh-day Adventist, which incidentally I was as well, and had then left that faith to join the Methodist faith when he married her mother. And so she, of course, I think her initial and of course as well the UNIA, it's it's indisputable that the UNIA was also forged around this kind of like Black Christian, a kind of Christianity that was also rooted and connected to the idea of Black liberation and Black progress. But I would say that when I'm thinking about a spiritual training, I'm also reflecting on the kind of sense of awareness or a kind of becoming of Amy Ashwood Garvey's consciousness that comes into being after she spends extended period of time living in West Africa and observing and learning about other forms of cultural practices. So I also see the spiritual in the moment where she talks about hearing music and hearing um, African drumming or hearing West African drumming practices for the first time, and me thinking about her love of sound and her love of music and what that kind would have evoked in her body in the thinking of that and in that experience. I'm also thinking a bit about when she, as a girl, she had learned of her African heritage and had learned that her grandmother was from the Ashanti region. And I'm also thinking about the experience she would have had of living there for that period of time, of living in Kumasi, of reconnecting with, which I didn't get to talk about in this presentation, but she did have the experience of reconnecting with her long lost ancestors, of having a formal naming ceremony, of living in that region, of eating food there, of, I just think about as well the kind of other spiritual things that might have come into being from her through that experience. But I also think about a kind of spiritual thing that would have come into being through the intimate friendships and relationships she had with her best friend, Claudia Jones, and the way in which they supported and nurtured each other's visions and aspirations. And so I think when I'm thinking of that, I think I'm thinking of something that is rooted in a kind of religious understanding of herself, but also in kind of experiences and relationships, and that there was a kind of thing that she wanted to bring about that into the way in which she wanted the young women who stayed at the center. And I think this comes back to the question about tensions between African and Caribbean. I think the kind of thing that she wanted to bring to the center was a kind of sense of a spiritual connectedness that potentially brought the threads of all of these different experiences and relationships and travels together to talk about a kind of kinship and a kind of care that they could have for each other. Yeah.
Wow. That was a wonderful question, but also, like I said before, and all the other responses, just a thorough and insightful response. So thank you. This question, they write, thank you so much for this teaching. I'm quite interested in futurities of Black feminist Grand Marronage and the possibilities creative writing may hold to keep us in our dreaming. And I'm particularly thinking of other histories, Atlantic and Middle Passage reimaginings. Are there any texts you would suggest?
Yes. Let me write them down. Um, so I feel in this moment, I want to mention in particular two texts by Black feminist comrades, colleagues, friends whose writing and voice and thinking have been instrumental for my own practice as a writer and thinking about the way in which I approached telling the story about Amy Ashwood Garvey from a space that explored a kind of creative and fragmented writing methodology rather than it needing to be every area completely developed and thought out, but thinking about the fragments as equally powerful to telling a Black feminist story. And that would firstly be Unruly Therapeutic Black Feminist Practices in Living Room by Feluke Taylor. Um, I highly recommend reading that book. It's beautifully written and it also offers, I think, quite a powerful mediation on what Black feminist writing is and what it like the kind of possibilities of it. I would also say Experiments in Imagining Otherwise by Lola Olufemi. I think the work that Lola has done there, both in terms of voice and form and the way in which she experiments with kind of archival layering and textured layering has been also really instrumental for the thinking around my writing and also my creative practice. And I also would say Jennifer Nash's book, How We Write Now, which is also about a practice of Black feminist writing, that has also been more recently. I wasn't reading that at the time that I wrote that book, but I've been reading it more recently as I've been thinking about methods of collaborative writing, Black feminist writing collaboratively. I've been reading that book with another colleague. That one has been really instructive for how I think about the future possibilities of my writing and also for the way in which I wrote this book on Amy Ashwood Garvey.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And the last question, I think this is really a way to, leave off or to end the teaching, but also culminates brings to the fore once again, like why Amy Ashwood Garvey for you. So the last question is, what
Hmm.
drew you to the work of Amy Ashwood Garvey?
What drew me to the work, I would say, would really be the realization that I had grown up as a person of Jamaican heritage, as a person with kind of parents that taught me a lot, were very instructive around Jamaica's history and our national heroes, and it taught me quite a bit about Marcus Garvey. That when I was a master's student in women's history at Sarah Lawrence College, and I decided that I would pursue potentially writing just like an essay on women in the Garvey movement, I was drawn to Amy Ashwood Garvey when I realized that there were two Amy Garveys, and then I realized that the kind of story that I had been told about the formation of the organization had been much more complicated than the fact that Marcus Garvey formed it and he married Amy Jakes Garvey and they created all of, they did all this work together. And so the fact that she had been erased from a story I had been told about Amy Ashwood Garvey, and sorry, about the formation of the UNIA. It just became something I wanted to initially read and understand and know more about. And I think that kind of thing of thinking about how someone could be so instrumental to the formation of the organization, especially once I started reading more and I learned that like, the earliest meetings of the UNIA were held at her parents' home in Kingston. When I learned that a lot of the initial uh like statements and aims of the organization, the motto, the critical motto of the organization, that her and Marcus Garvey had forged that together. When I read a lot of that and had realized that she had virtually been excluded completely from that narrative, it sort of drew me to it sort of really struck me with that question that I kind of started with, about like, how do we tell the stories about someone who was there and is present in all these really critical moments, but that her archive is fragmented. It's, and there's ways in which she's been intentionally erased and intentionally forgotten. And so it was it was sort of that. It was a kind of like personal experience of not knowing something that I thought I knew a lot about. And the more I learned about her, the more I understood how significant she was for these very transnational, like, political movements that she had lived in multiple different places. I mean, I think it's really important to say that she was like an early Black woman internationalist, traveling independently, moving between the Caribbean, the US, West Africa, and Europe as an unmarried woman, at the time that she was doing that. We're talking like the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. Like, that's incredible. And I sort of really wanted to be able to think about it. Sort of just introduced me to thinking more about how it could be possible for someone like her to be erased. Of course, as I understand how those things are really intentional, but it just made me feel, I feel like I could continue writing about Amy Ashwood Garvey for ages, because there are multiple more stories and other ways of being with her archive and about her life that I think I've only just scratched the surface on understanding. So I've been working on her since 2009, and I'm still doing more research on her. In a few weeks' time, going to Jamaica and trying to visit the place that she was living towards the end of her life, and trying to see if I can find and photograph where she's buried, in Calgary Cemetery. Like, there's more things that I could still write and say about her for probably years to come.
Wow. My screen on. Please, please, please purchase, support Dr. Nydia A. Swaby and buy this amazing work. And I think this work is like a serious like Black feminist intervention, because there is so little known about Amy Ashwood Garvey, and like you mentioned, her consistent erasure. You really have done something wonderful in allowing us to have a better understanding of her life and her or being at the vanguard of Pan-African feminist organizing. So thank you so much, Dr. Swaby. It's been a joy to learn from you, and to be connected to you. And thank y'all so much for coming to the teach-in. As you can see by the chat, Nadia, there's so many people saying thank you
Thank you so much.
for this inspiring and insightful and motivating teaching and valuable teaching. Thank you. So, once again, truly a testament to the mandate that you have and on your life and being a steward of the work. I think we're really called to this work. And so Amy Ashwood Garvey, I believe, is pleased. So thank you so much. I also want to shout out and thank our amazing ASL interpreters, Coffee and Michelle. Thank you for your kindness, and for joining us and for all that you do. I really appreciate you. And once again, this teach-in will live on Black Men Radical's YouTube. Super excited because Dr. Swaby will also be sharing a reading list, which we're going to be posting too. We're going to be posting, excuse me, that will accompany the recording of the teach-in. And please support, 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 support. Before I end, Dr. Swaby, do you have any final words or want to say anything?
Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to thank you very much, Jamie, for the invitation and the opportunity to share my work on Amy Ashwood Garvey, but really critically to read it through this idea of Black feminist marronage, and to kind of think of a way in which I might frame the work as she's doing as already meaningfully aligned with the work that you're trying to do, with Black women radicals. And I just really appreciate the opportunity, and to like think together and to sort of frame it in that way. And I really am excited for the future of what you're trying to build. And I certainly wish you all the best with it. And I also want to thank everyone that has joined the call, and for the really interesting and exciting questions that I received. And also just, yeah, it's just extra special as well to see colleagues here who I haven't seen in a while. And as I said, to see Pamela Mvote, who's actually literally playing Amy Ashwood Garvey in a play that's coming up. So it's actually such an honor. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity. And also, yes, thank you to the ASL interpreters. Always so great. I did not know that was going to be here. And I'm so grateful for you all making sure that this program is accessible to everyone. So yeah, thanks again. It's been a pleasure. Appreciate you all.
Thank you. Thank you. And when the school finally happens and opens, would love for you to host an in-person teaching. Um,
Ashe.
and so thank y'all so much. Enjoy your weekend, and we'll be posting about the recording and the reading list soon, but purchase this wonderful work. Okay, y'all. Have a great one. Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone. Thank you.
Thank you again, Michelle and Coffee.